Hello and welcome to MalMakes. Today we're doing a painting based off Pikmin 1. This is the full version. If you're interested in the time-lapse, you can click on the card here. Otherwise, let's get started. Now this idea has gone through a few different versions in my head of how exactly I wanted to paint it. First, someone gave me an idea of doing another Pikmin painting, and I thought about it'd be kind of fun to have a forest scene with little Pikmin hidden throughout it, maybe in some flowers or on tree branches. And I thought that would be fun, and it kind of reminded me of I Spy books. There's one page in particular I remember from being a kid of a forest scene, kind of like this little diorama of a forest scene. And that's kind of what that reminded me of, and it's always kind of what Pikmin games reminded me of as I played them. So I was looking into some I Spy books just to kind of remember how they were done, and I thought about kind of how it reminds me of tilt-shift photography, where you have a special lens or you use the Photoshop filter to kind of force photographs to look that way. It kind of makes them blurry in the foreground and the background, so you have this very shallow depth of field where only a very little part is in focus, and it makes it look very, very tiny even though it's normal size. So I thought about doing that, and I kind of wanted to try painting something like that. It's a trick of a camera, and I thought it would be still fun to try to do it with paint. So I looked at different areas from Pikmin 1, and the starting area of the last level of the first game kind of stands out in my memory. I really like how the pattern is where all the onions land. You kind of get this little path that weaves throughout the areas. There's the little flowers where you can switch your Pikmin color. So it kind of has a little bit of everything, and I thought it would be fun to use this area in particular. So my plan is to paint this part here super in focus. Everything's very sharp, all the lines are very clean, but everything else is going to be blurry, and we're going to do that with hard and soft edges. So all of the hard edges for things are going to be here at this landing site, and all of the soft edges are going to be everything else, the background and the foreground, to make them soft and look out of focus. So what I did first is I gessoed my canvas with kind of this green-gray color. I took white and black gesso, a little bit of phthalo green, and a little bit of burnt sienna, and kind of mixed all together and painted my canvas with that to kind of just re-gesso it this base color. That way I don't have to worry about the blank canvas showing through where I don't want it to be. It's going to kind of help me because it's close to where I want to be in colors anyway. So I'm going to start mixing up some of these colors back here for the background. I want to kind of draw this base plan here on the canvas, so I have that, and then I'm going to work on all of the background blurry areas. My chalk pastel sketch is a little bit different than my original. One of the things I didn't like was how much of the level was being shown. I think it was too distracting when I really want the focus to be here. So there is a rock in game there. It's probably not this big, but I wanted to put a rock there to kind of mask some of that busyness, so the focus was brought back here. And then to balance that rock, I put in some other rocks in the background. Now these ones are going to be blurry because they're in the background, but still having that same color palette in that area is going to help kind of balance this gray area here. Also, the big tree ends right here in my sketch. I brought it all the way down off the canvas to kind of make it look bigger and closer, and I also made it a little bit wider. Now this is going to get painted in the end, and I'm probably going to cover up some of these lines, but I wanted to have an idea of where it was and how much space it would cover by the time I'm done. So now it's time to start painting this background, and painting like this is all about having soft edges. I don't want to have like super strong contrast between colors because it'll look in focus. I need them to kind of blend as I'm painting so that they look blurry. So one of the ways I can do that is by keeping my paints wet. And as I paint, like if I paint a bright space here and then like a yellow next to it, I want to kind of blend the two of them together so that it looks blurry. And if the paints are still wet, I can do that. But another way is to use some glazing liquid to kind of make that yellow transparent and put that on top of the white so it looks like they're blended while they were wet. I like the colors I'm using. It just feels like it needs some focus. Right now, kind of every area that I've painted has every color that I've used. Kind of like camouflage, like it's kind of random and it's not really intentional. So what I need to do is bring some focus to this. Maybe make some more highlights in this area, shadows in this area, maybe some more highlights over here, just to kind of make it look like a natural forest where there's bright spots and dark spots. So what I'm doing is this brush has my color on it, which is currently kind of a bright green, and I'm bringing it onto the canvas and just kind of like tapping in where I want it to go, making like a little blob of color. And then with my other brush, I'm using some glazing liquid, which is basically a clear paint for golden. And on the edges of that blob, I'm just kind of softening it with that glazing liquid because it makes it transparent. And then I'm just brushing it out to kind of cover the rest of that space. So I'm going to keep working that way, trying to tone some of the brighter areas down, maybe work a bit darker into some darker greens, until I'm happy with this background, and then we'll start doing the trees in the same way. So I filled in everything using that same technique, where I lay down a color and then use glazing liquid to soften the edges to make it look blurry. I did that with the rocks, with the trees. I just did kind of like vertical marks on that. And now I kind of want to lighten up some of the areas in the forest. Originally, as I was working on this, it looked more like bushes or plants there on the forest floor, and it kind of looks like that in the background of some of these areas. But I've tried to work kind of on this area, making it look more flat, and now I just need to lighten up some of these areas so there's this kind of dappled sunlight effect on the forest floor. I've worked my way to the part that's going to be in focus here, and I've used a little bit of gray to bring in this rock texture. Now, because there's kind of an overhang with the grass, I'm using some shading gray, and just right along this edge here, I'm adding a little bit of that, so there's a little bit of a shadow here. And then I am scrubbing it down into the rock a little bit just to make it fade, but the sharpness of this edge and then all of the detail in here is what's going to make this look like it's in focus and this stuff look blurry. So the idea behind all of this is having lost and found edges. Lost edges are where things kind of blur together, where you have fuzzy transitions between them, where you don't have like a harsh line like right here. And then found edges are where you have a nice sharp transition, where everything is really crisp, where you have one color and it's right next to the other. But these lost edges back here are where things start to blur together, where I have kind of it fading in between all of these colors, and then the edges of these trees are kind of transparent, so you kind of see some of the yellow on the edges of the tree. So as I get closer to this spot here, I'm trying to do a transition between these lost edges and these found edges. So this rock I had just as blurry as this rock, but I wanted to have it start to come a little bit into focus because it's closer than this one is back here. So as I was doing some of the stone texture by just dry brushing grays and blacks and browns onto this area, I just used a little bit of that to kind of make it less blurry for this rock. These two trees should be a little bit more in focus with a little bit more detail, so once I start to use some browns again, I'll probably just kind of clean that up, make it a little bit sharper, but not as sharp as some of the stuff that will be here. Like I said, I dry brushed all of this in, used some shading gray just to kind of give it a little bit of shadow. Now that that's done, I can kind of work some of the grass on top because it kind of sits on top and curls over the edge just a little bit, so I can make that just a little bit more natural looking. I haven't touched any of the flowers that are going to sit in this area yet. I've been too focused on everything else, and I kind of like working on this really nice sharp stuff after doing all the blurry stuff for a while, so I think I'm going to keep working in here, maybe work on some of these areas over here where we get kind of that rusty red color that kind of brings in some of these walls in this area. The detail that I've been working on is mostly like this rusty metal piece that sits here as a wall, and then the bottom of the water. Now I want to make sure that the water is super clear just like it is in Pikmin, so I'm painting kind of the detail that's going to be on the ground underneath the water. So I've used some grays, some blue grays, and some black paint just to kind of give it that texture. I started by kind of stippling different colors like browns and stuff, and then I took some black paint and then just painted like a C, the letter C, kind of around each little pebble, just so it has this texture. Once it's dry, I can do a blue glaze over the top so everything is kind of casted blue, and then I can use some white to paint like highlights on top of the water. So it's going to kind of look like there's like a blue transparent piece on top of everything else. The rusty metal that sits back here and then on each side of the flame path, I'm not super happy with it yet, but I might do some of the water and then kind of clean that up a little bit. This one actually looks like it's standing up, but these ones here that are on each side of that flame path just don't look right. So I'm going to leave that alone for a little bit so it can dry, and then I can work on the water some more. And I'm going to keep trying to draw in the path that sits here, the spiral path where the onions land. That part is probably the trickiest part of this painting, honestly, to make sure that it's right in perspective here, where it's kind of foreshortened back on this ellipse. So I'm going to work on that for a bit while the stuff over here is drying. When I'm trying to paint transparent water like this, I like to use transparent colors, but also glazing liquid, which is just transparent paint. So I'm using things like the shading gray, which is a transparent black, zinc white, and then phthalo blue. And so I've kind of mixed all of those together until I have kind of this gray blue, and then I added more glazing liquid to make it even more transparent. That way I don't like lose any of this. I can always paint more layers on top if I want it to be more opaque or more blue, but I can't bring back the stuff I've painted over if I've made it too opaque to begin with. So I've mixed up this color here on my palette, and I'm just going to fill in on top of all of these pebbles. If you were right above this pattern on the grass, these two right here would kind of look a little more like a bullseye. Now what happens if you kind of move out over to the side is it becomes foreshortened like this. And if you look at the shape of this circle, it becomes an ellipse, where these two edges here are kind of the furthest left and right you can be, and this front part kind of stretches towards you and the back part reaches back. That way it looks like it's kind of laying down on the ground. So drawing an ellipse is one of the harder things I think in art to get right, because if it's not quite right, it's not going to look like it should. So what I did is I made an ellipse on paper first. So I kind of figured out the exact size I wanted it to be by roughly sketching in ellipses here on the grass, and then I measured that. So I measured how wide it should be and how tall it should be. And then I used paper to make sure that I had it perfect, because I could kind of fold it in all four directions and then make sure that it was equal all around. Once I had a nice ellipse, I traced it here onto the grass, so you can kind of see where all of that went. And I tried to kind of center it here on just the green part of the grass, so I figured out exactly where center was by kind of measuring here and dividing by 2, and then from the furthest out piece of this ellipse and the furthest out piece of this ellipse. So I kind of centered them around that. And anything that looks a bit strange because there is so much space around it will be filled with the violets, so it'll kind of balance all of this out in the end. But once I had my 3 ellipses here on the canvas, what I had to do next was figure out kind of the spiral and the path that leads around the bullseye ones. So I worked on drawing that in, and the spiral on this one is also going to be elliptical. So as you can see, like this bottom part of the path was around the outside here, And then once I got about here, I brought it in a little bit and then in a little bit, and then I just kept going, trying to keep all of the edges stretched out to the sides. And then once I kind of wrapped it around and got to this ellipse, I just kind of connected these two right here and then brought this one off to the side. As for the bullseye for the other two, I drew two more ellipses that were a bit smaller, doing the same trick where I'm folding it and then cutting it so it's equal. And then the same with this tiny one. So I could trace them here to kind of get a nice bullseye effect in the center of all of those spaces. So if you kind of stack all three of my little tracers, that's kind of what this space here looks like. So that's how I kind of got that perfect here on the canvas. And now that it's done, I can mix up a new sand color because I have to kind of finish the sand anyway and go back over all of my chalk lines. This clearing has a lot of detail, and all of that detail is really going to bring the focus to this area. It's going to be nice and sharp and have all of this interesting stuff to look at. So I've been working on these violets, and I started by painting kind of like a darker green where they were going to go, because they're going to kind of filter light a little bit and make it darker on the grass where they sit. So I painted that first, and then I started to paint some stems and some leaves, and then I used white to start to bring in the flowers. Because the center of those violets are like bright white, I wanted to paint that first, and then after it dries, kind of paint the edges of each of these petals a little bit more like sky blue colored. So I'm leaving that alone for now, and I'll be working on that soon. There's also kind of like a spike plant that sits over here on this side, and then there's the candy pop buds that sit here. But because of how I've done this with this hill being here, it's going to cut off them, and I really want, to show them because it's important to recognize this part of the game with those. So I'm actually just going to move them and kind of make that artistic choice so you can see them over here. I'm going to kind of paint them the same way I've been painting the violets, where I'm going to darken up where they're going to go, even though the tree has a shadow here already. And then I'll just fill them in with their three colors and then start to add some detail. And then all of this focus area is done. The hardest thing about these flowers is making sure that they're tiny and blurry back here, that they get bigger and more in focus and detailed here, and then they get blurry again and even bigger down here. So I kind of started with some glazing liquid in oranges and greens back here and just kind of tapped them in. And as I got here, I started to bring like actual strokes for the petals and leaves. I used glazing liquid for the stem first in a pen because that gave me a lot more control about deciding where they're going and how many. And now I can start to bring in greens for the front row and then the foreground here. And after I finish the greens, then I can move into the flowers, and then all of those are done. But I'm using glazing liquid as I get into the areas that are going to be blurry, like down here, and no glazing liquid in the areas that are in focus kind of around here. So that way that this is really sharp and it's really crisp and you don't see through it, and then down here you kind of see through the edges a little bit, so it has that blurry quality to it. I've been working on the big tree using some of the same colors as the other trees back here, but trying to kind of keep it the same as these two, where there's just a little bit of detail, slightly blurry, slightly out of focus, just to bring all that attention here. So I'm taking like burnt umbers, burnt sienna, and Mars black to kind of bring just a little bit of texture to this tree. I don't want to make it just like this stuff here where you can see every little bit of bark because that'll draw that focus away. So I think I'm just going to do a little bit more black here on the shadow side, and then it'll be done. And we're done! We have the final area from Pikmin 1. If you're interested in this piece, you could buy a poster or a phone case, or bid on this original canvas. There's links down below. Also, consider supporting me on Patreon. You can find out more at supportmal.com. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes of MalMakes. And I'll see you again here for another video game painting.